we're all products of our environment. We've all grown up with the messaging that's been around for the last 50 to 100 years. And the messaging has come from big pharma, it's come from big food, it's come from governmental organizations, it's come from doctors.
Grant, how did you find Carnivore?
Oh, well, first off, congrats and thanks to you for doing all your hard work. I mean, I definitely have to sort of publicly put that out there because you're doing the hard work in the trenches, behind the scenes. And the other piece of value you're bringing, I believe, to this sort of audience is there's the science side, but then there's the human side. And you bring that human side. And every time I watch a video from your channel, there's always a nugget or two that you pick away and you take and you go, I can relate to that. And so big thanks for doing all that. Carnivore. Okay. It's a long journey for me because I've been in the health and fitness industry my whole life and I've been retired now for 5 years. I'm 65. So it started a long time ago because I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And so I was part of the 60s, 70s environment in Canada. I'm from Calgary. So the standard Canadian diet, I guess you could say, but I remember things like margarine and white bread and TV tray dinners and Skippy peanut butter. And I mean, the list goes on. I was trying to think of a whole bunch. And, you know, if you think about the processed food industry and where it was at that time, and people were getting into that because it was kind of new, it was supposed to be better. So I ate a bunch of that stuff as well as some good stuff. And, you know, the whole thing, just grew up as a normal kid, was really active in a lot of sports, really loved sports. So by about the mid 70s, I sort of decided to get into fitness. I did my bachelor's degree in exercise physiology and played a lot of different sports. Hockey was my main sport. Lifting weights was my main sport. But in the early 80s, and this is just after the food pyramid came out in the States, and after we sort of got moved toward this low fat, high carb, you know, don't even look at an egg, don't look at anything with fat in it. And I just finished my degree in exercise phys and was just getting out in the industry. This is the very early 80s. And I thought to myself, I need something to do for the rest of my life to stay fit, because I had played hockey and my career was kind of over. When you're about 19 years old, your career is over in hockey. And I sort of said, well, okay, so I started running. And so I ended up running the Honolulu Marathon. And then the next year saw on ABC Wide World of Sports, the Ironman. I don't know if you can remember any of that at all, but on ABC Wide World of Sports, that's when it was on. And I got fascinated by that and started my triathlon career. So the decade of the 80s, I did about 50 triathlons and about 5 marathons, and was also swept along into the low fat, high carb, because that's what everybody was doing. They were carb loading. They were eating gels. We were eating granola bars. I remember eating rice cakes dry, which don't taste good. But, you know, keep the fat as low as possible. And then, of course, get into the carbs and sugar. And as a subculture, the endurance world or endurance athletics is still fairly married into that concept. So anyway, throughout those 80s, I did lots of exercise, lots of training. I worked in the fitness industry. I started a couple tri clubs here in Calgary. But the interesting thing about the 80s was when I look back now from my 60s, I have a little bit of wisdom. And I look back and I remember being sick or having flu 6 times a year. I remember getting bronchitis a couple times a year. I remember having sore knees and a back. And here I'm a young guy. I'm in my 20s. Now, at the time, you sort of think, well, you're doing lots of training. You're under a lot of stress. You're working, all those kinds of things. And you don't really make the connections to maybe I would have been a whole lot more robust had I eaten differently. But that's where the nutrition world was at that time. And then a very interesting thing happened to me by the end of that sort of decade, early 90s. I read a book by Dr. Phil Maffetone, who is fairly well known in the endurance world coaching community. And his book was revolutionary at that point in time because he talked about eating fat for endurance. And of course, every endurance athlete was eating sugar, not fat. It was like this is a revelation. Like fat fuels the mitochondria, it fuels long distance sports, which was just flipping the nutrition paradigm on its head. He also talked about using heart monitors and training aerobically and all those good kind of things, which is a topic for another video. But when you think about nutrition, fat was good. And that was a totally contradictory message from what we've heard from the last 10, 20 years. So I started going down that rabbit hole a little bit. And that's what really piqued my interest in nutrition. I started reading book after book, and there were lots of people that were writing books. Atkins, of course, had his book out at the time. There were the Eads, the Hellers, the Carbohydrate Addicts, Barry Sears with the Zone. There were a whole bunch of people jumping on that bandwagon through the 90s that basically were saying, hey, wait a minute now, this whole low fat, high carb thing is not really that healthy. And in Phil Maffetone's book, he talked about Syndrome X. And in the research, that's what metabolic syndrome or metabolic disease was called way back then. Talked about insulin, talked about sugar, spiking your insulin, raising your insulin, and of course, leading to, or being, the way I look at it, is we're a little bit like a tree. The roots in the ground feed the tree. And what you see above ground, all the leaves, metabolic disease, while a leaf would be cancer, another leaf would be, diabetes, another leaf would be obesity, another leaf would be autoimmune issues, mental health issues, gastrointestinal issues. And of course, when you look at a tree and it doesn't look healthy, what's the first thing you think about? Well, you water the roots. You don't fix the leaves. And sort of that's kind of our approach nowadays, is we do it that way. And what we're talking about here is let's get to the root of the cause. And of course, this is what Phil's whole idea was in the 90s. And a lot of people started getting on there. So I finished my master's degree in kines early 90s. And then for the next 20, 30 years or so the 90s, the 2000s, and mostly through the teens, 2000 teens, I was pretty low carb. I was pretty much eating some veggies, some fruits, low carb, but I would struggle because, like everybody else, I was an endurance athlete. I ate a lot of carbs. I still like Dairy Queen. I still like bread. I still like because they taste good. The problem is not necessarily, it wasn't as strong as maybe addiction, but it was, you really like the taste. And so you have a beer here and there, you have bread here and there, and you keep going. And so I sort of drifted. And our son came along in the early 90s. So sort of my middle years, 30s, 40s, and 50s, were really sort of doing some triathlons, because I ended up doing about 80. So I ended up doing 3 or 4 a year, backing off a bit and just working on my coaching practice, because I spent the bulk of my year from 92 till 2020. I guess it's about 30 years or so, coaching, helping people, coaching swimming, biking, running, weightlifting, nutrition advice, all that kind of stuff. So that's what I did for that interim period. But then there were a couple other interesting little pieces in there, and then I'll get to the carnivore. So there's one piece, 2013, 14, 15, where I decided to go more keto, because if you looked at the nutritional world, it had gone first off the low fat, high carb. Then it swung into, okay, Atkins, and let's get the carbs down, low carb. And then low carb kind of moves into keto. So I thought, being a kind of an early adopter, I thought, I'm going to give this a try. And sure enough, for 3 or 4 years there, from about 212 to about 215, 16, lost a little bit more weight. I was always, as a triathlete, a little heavy. I always weighed about 150, 60 throughout my whole life. There was one high point when I was a kid, I was up to 170, but I was always about 150, 160. And so I did the keto thing, and I got down to about 140, 145. And that was about, 13% body fat, maybe 12, 13%. But near the end of that, around 2015, 16, again, doing keto, I think is a little harder, because you're still eating some carbs. And so there's I want that extra beer, or I want to have a piece of bread, and 1 becomes 2, becomes 12, and on it goes. And so I sort of drifted up again, eating some carbs, weight went up a little bit. I'm in my late 50s now, kind of looking at retirement. What do I want to do? Those kinds of things. And then on a bike ride in the middle of late 2019, I had some pain. I'm going up a hill, and it was pretty sharp. It was like, oh, this is like, and I didn't feel good. And it was about half, three quarters of the way through about a 1 hour ride. It wasn't a long ride, but we were going up a real steep hill. And my heart rate was up at 180, 85. So I had a higher heart rate. And I went, whoa, that is a real flag. So I, make a long story short, got a doctor's appointment, got into the system, the allopathic system, which took a while, and ended up with a double bypass surgery. Yeah, that was a few months later. Anyway, the timeline, it's pretty close to that anyway. And yeah. And so, I went through a period of a few months where we were doing the diagnoses, trying to figure out what's going wrong. And that period of time, I was a little bit out of breath, couldn't exercise much, didn't feel that great, and ended up with double. Now, one of my family histories is on my mom's side, I have hypercholesterolemia. So my mom had really high cholesterol. So my doctors, my whole life, I've always had high total cholesterol and high relative LDL. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole too much because I've probably watched a few thousand videos on blood lipids, but my LDL total cholesterol weren't super high. They're maybe 1.5 to 2 times the normal, maybe 2.5 times the normal ranges. So they weren't sky high, but they were high. So I always resisted medication. My doctor did put me on a statin for a couple of years, and then I got some muscle cramping. That was during that keto period from 2013 to 2015. But I eventually trickled it down or titrated the dose down to the bare minimum and then finally let it go. So the allopathic world, the cardiologists all said it was basically due to my heredity, but I'm not sure anymore. I kind of have a different picture of that now, which I can tell at the end of the story. So anyway, had a bypass surgery. That was 2020. Retired from coaching. That basically, and of course, we know what happened in 2020. Everybody was sort of shut inside, and I couldn't book any gymnasiums or tracks or pools to run any of my programs. So it literally retired me. And I had cut back my business to about 50% at that point. Literally, and my wife and I were set up. So that's basically when I took my hands off the wheel and said, okay, I'm retired. Let's just focus on me for a while. So 2020 was basically devoted to getting out of the hospital, getting recovered, getting some exercise going again, getting myself healthy, starting some low carb. And then by about 2021, and of course, I'm starting to watch videos now. I'm starting to do a deep dive, starting to really do my research. And about mid 21, I said, okay, it's time to now really take the bull by the horns, so to speak, and get into keto and then migrate that toward carnivore. So I started late 21. So if you look, we're late 24. By the time I hit cardio, it was early 22. So we're almost 3 years in being sort of the carnivore journey. And interestingly enough, everything improved. Like I got down to a weight of 137 within about 4 months, which is the lightest in my entire life. About 10% body fat, 11% body fat. And it hasn't moved since, even though I'm full and satiated all the time. Whereas before, when I was a triathlete, you would think training 10 hours a week and eating, a low-fat, high-carb diet that you would, get lean, but I didn't. And I was always hungry all the time. I would eat 6, 7, 8 times a day back in the 80s. But now, 2 meals a day, fine. Some days, occasionally, I'll do 1 meal a day because you're so satiated. You're full as well as you feel good. You feel like, okay, I've got something on my system and I can go okay. So one of the things I did in the last 3 years when I went carnivore, there's been a few things, but one of the main things I did, I don't know when I started this, might have been 6 months in, I started thinking, oh, there's been a whole bunch of changes. So get your phone out and start writing down the things you are observing changing in your body. And some of these are kind of scientific and some of them aren't, but I now have my list on my phone, which will show, and I'll actually go through these, but there's 43 items here in no particular order that I have listed down that are things that I've seen change in my body from the age of 62 to 65, back in training, back exercising, back lifting weights a couple of times a week, back swimming a couple times a week. In fact, this last summer I did an ultra swim. And here's a side story. My ultra swim last summer was 4.5K, about 10-20% longer than Ironman. And I've got about 6 reference swims from my 30s at that distance. And I was within 3% of my fastest time. And that's 30 some years later. So something's working. Because you would expect their performance would decline at a slightly greater rate, but it was within 3%. So anyway, that's another thing I need to put on this list. Actually, I haven't even put that on the list. So anyway, I thought I would go through the list, and I can bundle. Yeah, okay, I can bundle some of them up, and I can. And again, the list is sort of my observations. A lot of them are very subjective. There's a few objective markers that I have that I can share, but most of them are subjective, and most people with their health generally use subjective markers. How do they feel, how their joints are, how much pain they're in, that kind of thing. So that's sort of me. So anyway, first thing I put down was my foot pain was gone. So I had 2 problems with my, especially left foot. I had plantar fasciitis, but I also, when I ran, the heels and my balls of my feet would be painful. Well, that's completely gone. And I had that for 30, 40 years. So I don't know if that's, and it wasn't dramatic, but it was always there. I would always try to sit down because my feet would get sore. That's gone. And my plantar fasciitis now is almost completely gone. It's just a little bit in there, and I only feel it every now and then. So that's a dramatic improvement. Those 2 things with my feet. So that's 1 and 2. I play the piano. I love playing the piano. It's one of the things I'm doing in retirement now, because I played a lot as a kid, and I've just picked it up as a hobby again. And this joint and this joint and this joint and this one on this thumb would always get sore. They'd hurt, and I'd go, do I have arthritis? And they'd creak. Like you wake up in the morning and they go creak, 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 or creak. Nothing now. That's gone. So I don't know if that's arthritis or not. I really don't know. Arthritis is kind of a general term. Arth meaning joint, itis meaning inflammation. But they're smooth. They're not creaky, and they don't get sore. And they would get sore. And I play the piano a fair bit, so that's gone. Another thing that I suffer with all my life is really bad rosacea, especially on my cheeks. And you can see they're a little red now, but that's about 80% better. But again, I suffered probably 30, 40 years. So I don't know if that's going to continue to get better, but it's pretty good now. I just have a reddish sort of tinge, but I don't have any of the breaking out or any of the flaking or any of that kind of stuff happening anymore. So that's gone. Number 5, blepharitis. At the end of the 80s, early 90s, I would have blepharitis, which is an inflammation of the lining, like your eyelash line. It's sort of like a dandruff of your eyelash. And the doctors will give you ointments. Sometimes you'll take an antibiotic. And I went to see an eye doctor for about 15 years, 20 years. And it was always there. And then this one went away when I went keto in 2012 to 14. Within about 6 months, gone. Didn't need any of the drops for dry eye, didn't need any of the antibiotics. And my eye doctor, he was a low carb guy, a keto guy. He kept me coming 3 extra years so we could have a conversation about nutrition, not about the eyes. He says, you've cured your eyes by doing the nutrition. He just wanted to see me so we could chat about how it helps with inflammation. So that's gone away. I don't worry about my eyes. I used to get styes as well a lot through my 40s, sort of into my 50s. I haven't had a sty for, I don't know, I can't remember, 3, 4, 5 years. It's been a long, long time. So that's gone. So the dry eye, the blepharitis is improved or gone. Exercise recovery. Point number 8 here for me, way quicker. I would get really sore. I was one of these athletes that would get sore a lot. And if I lifted weights or do any anaerobic or hard, higher intensity work, I'd be sore for days. And now mild, and then it's gone. So I find exercise recovery, even though you would think As an older athlete, 65, comparing myself to a younger athlete, 35, I'm way less sore, way less sore. And I also find that the muscle building and the muscle sparing effect of being on a carnivore diet is much greater. I can maybe miss weights for a couple weeks on vacation. My wife and I went to Europe for 3.5 weeks last year, and I literally started out at the same weights I left off. It doesn't just sort of disappear. And I'm more muscular now than I was 30 years ago. So you could build muscle, it doesn't matter your age, but as long as you give the muscle the substrate necessary, which is the proteins, that's what I've noticed. I've noticed that building the muscle is just a little bit easier. The losing the body fat. I'm 137 now. I'm about 11% body fat. I've had that tested using both various methods of scanning. So I'm at my ideal weight. My body comp is perfect. I have a 30-inch waist. I feel great about that, but I've never been this lean my entire life, even though I had a whole career of triathlon. And it's been easy to get there. That's the interesting thing. It just came off. Didn't really do this diet to improve my weight. I did it to feel better. I did it to improve my heart health. And I did it to, basically be healthy in my senior years. That's why I did it. I didn't do it because I really felt I needed to lose weight. I was still pretty good. I was around 17, 18% body fat, weighing about 150, but I lost that 13, 15 little extra pounds very effortlessly. And keeping it off, here's where a little dysmorphia occurs. I feel full all the time, so I sort of expect to put weight on. So I've gone through, I hardly weigh myself anymore, but I keep thinking to myself, I've been eating a lot, whatever. I go down, I weigh myself, hasn't changed. It's like, I would expect, because in my mind, I'm thinking, because I'm full, I'm eating really well. I'm thinking, I've eaten a lot in the last bit. We went to Europe last year, and I had a few digressions in Europe. I had a couple German beers and a few desserts here and there. Well, I'm thinking, oh man, I've put 5 pounds on. And in the past, I would have put 5 pounds on. Got back, I think it was about a pound up. And within a week, it was like gone. It's like I expected 5, got 1. So I find eating this way, your metabolism, and I'm pretty sure biochemically, because insulin's pretty balanced and low now, that it would take more to shove that up over time again. So I think that's probably why that one's good. So I'm very satiated. The gastrointestinal improvements, I've written down point 12, 13, 14, 15. I got a flat stomach, no bloating, no flatulence, very little, no stomach pain. On the old diet, eating high carbs and stuff like that, you would be bloated on and off. You would have stomach pain a little here and there. And you just think, oh, well, that's normal. That's normal. You'd be having flatulence throughout the day, I don't know how many times, but now it's like, that's kind of gone. Like, where did that go? So that's all improved, and no stomach pain. So those are all good things. I've noticed small changes in that. Energy, dead even, versus highs and lows. In my 50s, oftentimes I'd feel like, and if I had the opportunity, I'd want to have an afternoon nap. I'm just tired, middle of the afternoon. Now I'm not tired. Now it's like, okay, I'm just sort of like the Energizer battery. I'm not on a high, which, I can feel like I drink decaffeinated coffee maybe 3-4 times a week. If I drink a caffeinated coffee, I'm on a high. I can feel myself buzzed for a day. So I'm not on that or a high from sugar, but I'm not crashing either. So somewhere in between those 2 points is a nice sort of steady eddy energy, basically. So that's sort of what I feel. So I'm working my way down the list here. We're at, my mood is level and stable, oral health, and plaque buildup. Here's a really interesting one. So my whole life, I always had plaque buildup quite a bit. And my dentist always had me back every 6 months. Every 6 months. Well, the last appointment was 18 months apart. and she hardly had to scrape in the cleaning, maybe a little bit. Whereas in 6 months, 20 years ago, they would be taking buckets of plaque off, like literally scraping my teeth quite a bit. So way less plaque, I notice. The teeth feel smoother. I don't feel like I have any bad breath. It doesn't feel like I brush, but it doesn't feel like you have to brush. And another thing the dentist used to do is they used to test your pocket depth, which is the health of your gums. So the gum on the tooth, and there's a little pocket there, and they'll shove a millimeter sort of instrument down. And I believe a 3 is normal. Don't quote me on that. I think a 3 is about normal, 2, 3. And then a 4 is like a bigger pocket, and a 5 is getting toward like gingivitis or gum disease. And I had 2 or 3 5s and a bunch of 4s and 3s. And then about 3 years ago at my dentist appointment, I had 1 4 and all 3s. And the last dentist appointment, which was just a couple of weeks ago, she didn't even check. She just went around and checked for cavities, and that was that. So I'm thinking, did she just admit that, or was that just forget testing the pockets because they all look good? Because now when I dental floss, I can floss pretty hard, no bleeding, none whatsoever. Whereas before, I would get a little bleeding, if I went hard or whatever, but now that's completely gone. So that's sort of, I think that reflects, I at least think that's a little bit better gum health. And so, all those little wee capillaries that feed all those very small little pieces of skin that are around the teeth are all getting perfused better. They're getting more oxygen, so they're getting healthier. So anyway, that's sort of my take on that. The sun, here is another fascinating one. My skin, what a change there. Now my rosacea is completely diminished. And fascinating enough, when I was a kid, I used to have, dandruff, lots of dandruff, and I'd have a little bit of eczema when I was a kid. Don't have that anymore. Now that I think went away during low carb, but certainly don't have it now as an adult. But the sun, I would always wear sunscreen. I would burn in about 20 or 30 minutes, the standard kind of length. And my wife, she has fair skin, and she would burn quicker. Well, I didn't use light sunscreen last year, and I'm out on 1.5 2 hour bike rides. I go darker. The tan lasts. I'm from Calgary, so at the end of summer, we have a summer place in Penticton where it's really warm. And when we come home in September, October, in the past, my tan would literally flake off in the shower in the first few weeks because you're dry. And back to Calgary, back to altitude. I think we're 3,500 feet here. And it's very dry in Calgary, sort of like Phoenix. And so my tan would go, it would just flake right off. Now my tan lasts almost until the next year. And, it gets lighter, but it's still darker than white skin. And I don't burn. And I tan. And my wife, who's never tanned, she's always burned and always had to use sunscreen. She hardly had to use any sunscreen this year, and she's browner. So there's a real benefit, especially if you're an outdoorsy and you like to hike or bike or whatever, like I do. It's something I don't need anymore. It's like my.
So your wife's on carnivore too?
Okay, yeah. She sort of tags along in my journey, and she's more ketovore. I'd say she likes some avocados, cottage cheese. She has a little salad every now and then. But for the most part, she's eating steaks, she's eating eggs, she's eating fish. She likes a little more fish than I do. I like ribeye steaks. That's my favorite go-to almost every night. She likes a little more fish, some salmon. She likes her shrimp. She loves shrimp cooked in butter with salt, natural Peruvian or Himalayan pink sea salt. But and now that we're retired, I'm doing more of the cooking because I'm more into it's pretty simple because I just basically cook a steak up or cook eggs up or whatever. It's a pretty simple recipe or a pretty simple menu. I always say to Wendy in the morning, you want eggs? Do you want eggs or do you want eggs? But she's fine with it and she's okay. And she's a little older than I. She's 71 and no meds, ideal weight, perfect health. She's an ex-ballerina dancer. She has great mobility and great strength. She does her strength training, does her treadmill. So she's really healthy. She's actually probably a little healthier than I am. Because I think it might have been part of the start I had. I'm not sure. These are just my theories going through my head. Anyway, I'll keep working down my list here. We're gone through the sunburning and the tanning, so we're up to 20 some here. I've combined a couple. The other thing I've noticed is the fingernails, and cuticles. I used to get hangnails all the time, like all the time. No more hangnails. And the nails are harder, and I got to cut them every week. They're growing faster. And my wife has her nails have gotten thicker and harder. She literally has nails that are half an inch longer than the end of your finger. And they're like an artificial nail. They're that thick and hard, like bulletproof nails kind of thing. So I've noticed that small change. Mental clarity, much. I've no mental fog, no kind of yawning. There's another little thing I actually haven't written down. I don't yawn much. I might yawn once a week or twice a week, but I that could be because of blood sugar crashing. But I would yawn more 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So that's something I need to think about. As far as some blood data, my HDL went up 20%. My triglycerides dropped by 50%, which is what you would see. So your HDL trig ratio, which should be below 1 ish or 1.5 ish, is mine's 0.8. So that's good, which we won't do a deep dive into lipids, but supposedly I'm making fluffy LDLs and my metabolic environment of the blood is pretty good. So I've seen those changes. Now my LDL, I'm still on a very small dose of cholesterol medication, so it's controlled. So my cholesterol level is fairly low, which is, I'm actually have an appointment booked with Dr. Robert Cyrus. He's the carbohydrate addict doctor, and because he did his PhD in atherosclerosis, as well as he's an MD, as well as he's a surgeon. So he kind of knows the whole deep dive in the lipid areas, because I want to find out what I need to do going forward, because my doctor only looks LDL-C, and he says I want to be as low as possible. And I'm going, no, I'm not so sure about that anymore. And my cardiologist 2 years ago, about a year into cardio or into carnivore, my cardiologist, she discharged me. She looked at my sheet. She looked at me. She did a physical. She says, nothing else I can do for you. Says, see you later kind of thing. So as far as the Canadian allopathic sort of dome that I'm under, I still just see my family physician, who I actually haven't seen for 2 years. So haven't been to the doctor for a while. Haven't had a need to go to the doctor. So that's a good thing. My hemoglobin A1C. Now this is an interesting one. 2.5 years ago, this would be about 2.5 years, 2 years-ish, after my heart, or about a year and a half, something like that. As I was transitioning, just at the beginning of the transition into sort of keto and carnivore, my hemoglobin A1C was actually 6.2, which is like into the pre-diabetic range. That actually scared me more than my heart bypass, because I know about syndrome X and metabolic syndrome. I said, well, that is like the root of the tree. So that was one of the major reasons why I motivated myself to get into carnivore, was because I knew, I got to get hemoglobin A1C down, and it's now down to 5.7. So it's moving down. I have not had a blood test for 2 years. So I actually don't know what it is today. So next few months, hopefully under Dr. Cyrus's sort of guidance, we'll see what that is. Here's a couple of other ones. As an aging male, my PSA, your prostate number, had been climbing up. My dad, he died at 88, but he did have prostate issues. And maybe, I don't think he had prostate cancer, but his PSA was pretty high. I think it was 7 or 8. It was very high. And he was being monitored by a urologist all the time. And my PSA was in the 1.5, 1.8 range. And I've been watching it climb by like a tenth every 5 years, just go up and up. And in 5 years ago, I was starting to have some troubles peeing a lot at night. I even had pain a few times. Well, that's all gone. And my PSA number was up to 2.3, 2.4. The last test was 1.8. So it fell back down. So I haven't had it tested for a couple of years, but my urination's been basically the same for the last 3 years. And I only pee a couple times a night, which is sort of normal for a 8 or 9 hour sleep at night and 65. So, but I haven't any issues with that. So I'm very interested to see what that number is. Here's a couple. When you get out of the hospital, I never had high blood pressure. My blood pressure was always about 120/80. And they give you a whole sort of cocktail of meds. So after a year or so, got off the high blood pressure medication, and I take my blood pressure once every 3 months or so, 2 months. I just monitor it every now and then. But I've noticed a slight dip. I'm down to like 115/70, 65/70. And most of my adult life, I was about 120/80. So I would say I've slipped down a little bit. Again, I don't have, a real accurate measure of that metric, but it seems like it's just a little bit lower. So anyway, that's blood pressure. And of course, I'm off all the post-op medications other than the cholesterol lowering, which I'm hoping to titrate that off, actually. Okay, here's a couple other things. When I was 56, 57, I'd look in the mirror and my beard was 100% white. It's not 100% white anymore. It's maybe 10% pepper. It's like, where did that come from? So there's a change I've noticed. My eyesight, interesting thing with my eyes, I've had these glasses now 7 years, and up close, I'm still a little blurry. Distance, I'm still a little blurry, but when I'm around a table talking to people at dinner or whatever, I often take them off now. So slight improvement, I'd say 5% improvement, or at least a halting of the deterioration of my sight. So it's been 7 years since I've needed a prescription. I don't think I need one for another while. So, and oftentimes you need to go back frequently to continue to get your eyesight, because you're getting worse than your current glasses are. So I think that's a little bit of a win. Couple of other things here, just getting down near the bottom of my list now. I taught swimming all my life. So I was in pools all my life, probably in a pool, at least 6 times a week on average, because I would teach classes every evening. I'd teach one-on-one lessons. I would swim myself, and my skin was always dry. And I would always scratch going to bed because Wendy would have to put moisturizer on and da-da-da. Now I am swimming a little less, but my skin now is basically smooth and soft and oilier. I haven't had to scratch for years, a couple of years, 3 years now. So, my elbows are soft, my knees are softer. They used to be really dry, and, you're thinking, well, maybe that's because you're in a pool a lot, you're having a shower a lot, those kinds of things, but I haven't changed that a lot, but the skin's a lot better. So I've really noticed a lot of change. There were 2 things that happened to me right at the about a year after my operation, between about a year and a half after my operation. I would get a pounding heart rate. After I got off the beta blockers, which was May of 21, that fall, just before I went keto, I, for 3 or 4 months, started to get a pounding heart rate. Now, I don't know if that was the adjustment off of the beta blocker, because you're on a beta blocker for a year. That's the sort of standard they give you after a heart operation. But when I started keto, my heart went silent. And then I went carnivore. I haven't experienced any of that. My heart's completely silent now. So I don't know. Now, those are 2 sort of coincidental variables. So I don't know. But, and then I had, that fall, I also had a little anxiety as well because of that. I get my heart would pound. I'm wondering, oh my gosh, what's going on? All that kind of stuff. But the level of anxiety I have around that, that's completely gone. That's completely gone. And the last thing I wrote on my list, point number 43, and I put a bunch of these together, but that's basically my whole list, was most of my life, My 30s and 40s and 50s for sure. I was always, my wife would say I'm an owl and she's like a squirrel. She's up in the morning, or what's the birds and owls or whatever. But I was an owl. I'd always sleep. I always go to bed a little later, and I would always drag myself out of bed, like you're kind of hobbling. And I always put it down to exercise and training. You know, you sore knees and your back, and you're like, oh, you're trying to recover from the last workout. But even if I take 2, 3 days off, I'd still have to drag myself kind of out of bed. Haven't had to drag myself out of bed for the last 3 years. Just get up, go. Just get up, go. So sort of that post-exercise soreness or knee soreness or achy joints, that's gone. And I like to be active. I like to continue to be active and do stuff. And so that's a big win when your joints don't hurt. So that's been good. So the last 3 years of carnivore have been pretty good.
Wow.
Really good.
So have you had anyone around you kind of say, what are you doing?
Yeah, lots. And of course, when you tell them, and it's a hard thing to describe. So most people, when they ask or they're interested, want a short answer, like a 1-minute bite. So you have to kind of condense what you're telling them. So I sort of say that I'm eating ancestrally. I'm eating nutritionally dense. And most foods that are nutritionally dense are from the animal kingdom. And so that's sort of what I say, because most people, when I start describing, carnivore diet, they think you're crazy. And the reason they do is because they've grown up in the generation of the opposite. I mean, we're all products of our environment. We've all grown up with the messaging that's been around for the last 50 to 100 years. And the messaging has come from big pharma. It's come from big food. It's come from governmental organizations. It's come from doctors, and it's gone through this evolution. And you can even see that in the nutritional world, where it went, Ansel Keys, and then fat was villainized, and then low fat, high carb, and then the pendulum swang to low carb, then keto, then carnivore, then lion. And it's sort of, you can see the whole evolution of the industry go that direction. But to explain that in a short conversation around dinner doesn't work. They just think you're kind of crazy. But a few people ask if you are. So I just sort of say I'm eating more ancestral. I'm eating more from the animal kingdom because I'm eating for nutritional density. And then sometimes I throw a few facts out, like in an egg, there's 80 or 90 nutrients. And, in ruminant meats, there's thousands of nutrients. And so you get a lot of really good bioavailable, nutrient dense foods if you eat, ruminant meats and eggs and stuff like that. So that's sort of how I couch it. I still haven't figured out the perfect way to answer the quick question. But that's sort of kind of how I.
Have you had anyone want to give it a go?
Yes. Yeah. There's one ex-client that gave it a go. He's now a year into it and says he'd never do anything different. He's 50. He's done a few Ironmans, and he says, I can't believe it. He's put on muscle. He's lost fat. He's, stronger, he's fitter, he's faster, he feels better. I mean, I've had him do it. My wife feels better. She lost just vicariously, or just through me, or just tagging along. She lost about 15 to 20 pounds. So she's down to within about 5 of her almost ballerina weight she was when she was back in university days. So, and again, it came off sort of effortlessly for her. It just sort of slid down. And so she's done it. I've had a few other friends dabble with it and try it a little bit. That's about it so far. I haven't pushed it too much. So
nice. So if someone came to you for advice and said, okay, well, I want to give this a try, Grant, but I'm skeptical, but I'm willing to do 90 days. What would you advise them to maximize their chances of success?
that is the key question. I mean, my journey's been a little slower. It's been sort of an evolution. And so the first thing I sort of suggest people do is to, have some protein every time they eat, and try to just have a few vegetables and maybe a little bit of fruit. So stay away from the real bad stuff, the processed foods, the grains, the processed buns, stay away from anything man has made. I think in our ignorance, man has created, I heard a statistic the other day that man has created like 6 million foods, different types of foods. Just when in fact, how many do we really need that give us everything we require? Because all we require is protein, fat, micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, and water. Those are really the four things that we can live on. And our bodies
And
like,
we're always told that we should balance
yeah,
what we're eating. Well, 6 million foods is a lot of stuff to balance at one time.
yeah, and perhaps greater variety brings greater problems because if you're eating 150, 200 different kinds of foods, you're having sushi one night and Chinese another night and burgers the next night and salads and pounding back a bunch of fruits and then you're eating scones and then different coffees and going to Starbucks. Well, how many different ingredients have you thrown at your body to try and deal with over a week or even a couple of days? And so, whereas if on this diet, basically my diet is I have a coffee in the morning or a bone broth. I kind of alternate days. It's decaf with cream. Midday, it's 4 eggs, sea salt, and some beef or leftover steak or bacon or chicken or something that's left over. I usually have some meat with my eggs midday, and then I'll finish that off with a little bit of high fat, plain, basic yogurt. Sometimes I'll have a little fruit and yogurt. And then dinner's almost always a ribeye steak. And I usually eat about a 14 ouncer and I'll throw it on the pan, salt to one side. After 5 or 6 minutes, flip it over and I'll butter and salt the other side. And occasionally I'll melt blue cheese on top of it. Really tastes good. And I'll just eat the steak. If I go out dining, basically what I do now in restaurants is I drink fizzy water and occasionally I'll have a Michelob Ultra. And that's a beer that's a low carb beer, 2 grams of carb. It's like a Sleeman 2.0, or I don't know if they have one in Japan like that, but it's a low carb beer, but low alcohol as well. And I'll have one of those with a water chaser. So I'll drink a beer, drink water, drink beer, drink water. So I'm just kind of watering it down, but I get the taste. And I'll order some meat or some fish. And I'll usually tell the waiter or the waitress, never ever just hold the starches because I'm not going to eat it. Save it for the next person. And then they'll usually, I've given up saying stop the veggies. So they'll put veggies on your plate. And I say, don't give me extra veggies and I'll just nibble away at the veggies. Lots of times I leave half the veggies. And I've noticed with my own physiology that asparagus, carrots, broccoli, little cauliflower doesn't seem to affect me. I don't really notice it from a blood sugar perspective. So if I have that occasionally, it's not a deal breaker, an issue breaker for me.
Yeah, I think the thing when you go to the restaurant is probably not so much the veggies. It's making sure they don't put that crazy sauce on the steak or something like that, right?
Yeah, a lot of times I'll have them bring my steak with butter. A lot of times I order extra butter. I was just at Swiss Chalet the other day and I had ribs, scraped the sauce off. I had a quarter chicken with the ribs, and then they had some veggies, which was broccoli and cauliflower, and I had them bring me 3 extra butters, and I just put the butter on them and had a bit of that. I might have had 2 things of broccoli, 1 of cauliflower. That was about it. Not much. So, and the interesting thing about food is I think we eat for 3 reasons. We eat for the taste, the hedonism. I think we eat for the energy from the fats or the carbs. And I think we eat, thirdly, for the nutrition, for all the nutrients we need to repair our body and be healthy. So those 3 reasons. But I think most people and our entire society, our entire dining out experience, it's all been based around taste. Because whenever you sit down with a group of people and they're pulling out the menus, oh, what do I want to eat today? And you could tell it's more, they're probably hungry, probably haven't eaten for 4, 5, 6 hours. And the first thing, oh, what's tasty? What do I want to eat? What do I want to drink? And and that's what drives most people's decisions as to what to eat, as opposed to nutrition or energy. Because if we were to flip it around, you'd be choosing mostly for nutrition and mostly for energy, and you'd be choosing fat because fat is clean burning where sugar isn't. So anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so Grant, how can people reach out to you? Do you have any social media or any way of getting in contact?
I don't. My son makes his living actually on YouTube, but not me. So and I don't have a channel or anything like that. So just my email. Probably just use my email. It will probably get a few emails tomorrow. Probably a lot, and I can just sort of get back to people. So I've sort of retired a little quieter.
No worries. Well, I'll link to your email below. Um, Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story, Grant. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me, and again, thanks to you for doing all the hard work you do behind the scenes.